I solemnly swear that I am up to no good, and I also solemnly swear that I will try to remember that that is how we are supposed to start this podcast. Welcome to Dear Mr. Potter. I'm Alistair Stevens. This is, believe it or not, the 50th session in our series exploring and analysing and celebrating J.K. Rowling's world-changing, genre-defining, industry-transforming fantasy series, Harry Potter. We have spent so far 9 episodes on The Philosopher's Stone, starting back in May of 2015, 9 episodes on Chamber of Secrets, 13 episodes on Prisoner of Azkaban, 5 on Ursula K. Le Guin's A Wizard of Earthsea, and this is our 13th session in what looks to be a... let's call it a 20-session series on Goblet of Fire. If we include the movie right at the end, I think we're probably going to spend 20 sessions all in all talking about the rest of this book. We have 3 books left to go in the series, of course, all of which will probably take us around 20 sessions each, I would imagine, plus some extra stories in between. So there are probably something like 85 episodes, maybe 90 episodes of Dear Mr. Potter left in the big bucket of podcast episodes that I keep under my desk and pull out one a week just so I can distribute it to you all. Something like 85 episodes, which will carry us through to the very end of December 2019, or given our propensity for loquaciousness here on the Dear Mr. Potter podcast, and given, for example, the fact that I have no confidence whatsoever that I'm going to make it through all the slides that I've prepared this week, for example, I think we'll probably end up running into the spring of 2020. So there's a lot of Dear Mr. Potter left, but I wanted to take this opportunity because we as human beings love big round numbers. I wanted to take this opportunity to thank you all for listening to the show, for sharing the show, for joining the community, for sending me email messages and Twitter messages and forum posts about Dear Mr. Potter, about your love of Harry Potter, much more importantly, and of course for joining me here in these live sessions. This show, all my shows, all of my work that I do here at Point North Media is possible only because of your support and enthusiasm and positivity, and I am so humbled and grateful to receive those things in spades in the quantity in which I receive those things. You guys are just fantastic. So here, he said, lifting the last little drag of his wine here is to the next couple of years in the company of Ron and Harry and Hermione, and of course in your fine company too. Cheers. And with that said, let's get into the reading. In fact, before we get into tonight's reading, which will be the end of Chapter 26, Chapter 27, and theoretically Chapter 28 of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, a quick scheduling note. I am going to be traveling at the beginning of next week, which means that I won't be available to podcast during our regular DMP slot on Tuesday evenings. But rather than skip a week, I've decided to move the schedule up by a couple of days. So the next episode of Dear Mr. Potter, the 51st episode of Dear Mr. Potter, instead of taking place next Tuesday evening, will take place on Sunday evening. That is 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, Sunday, April the 22nd. So that is only 5 days from now instead of the usual 7. I hope that you will be able to join me. So with all of that said, let's get into our reading for tonight. And before we begin, I suppose, I've been thinking a lot about merpeople, you guys. I've been thinking a lot about the second task and the mechanic and mechanism of the second task, I suppose. We talked a little bit last week about the ambiguous warnings that we've received about the second task, originally from the egg and then from the merpeople song when Harry is, in fact, beneath the waters of the Great Lake, talking about the possible consequence that will ensue if you fail to rescue your hostage in the allotted hour, and the ambiguity there, and the possibility that we can wryly acknowledge that no one actually tells a lie at any point. No one actually says that the hostages are going to be killed. And certainly with the inclusion of Gabrielle Delacour, I certainly hope that no one is going to be killed at the end of the second task if they fail to be rescued. That would be, well, a pretty grim turn for the Harry Potter series, even at this point. But I've been thinking about the merpeople and, well, not to put too fine a point on it, what did the merpeople get out of their role in the second task? And my initial response to this was, I must admit, a little cynical. I was concerned that we were seeing here an implicit subjugation of another sapient magical race on the Hogwarts grounds, I suppose. And by Hogwarts grounds, I suppose I'm expanding to include the Forbidden Forest, which we'll visit later in this week's reading. I was thinking about centaurs, and I was thinking about giant spiders, and I was thinking about house elves, and I was thinking about goblins, and I was thinking about even, some of the magical creatures that Hagrid has been taking care of. We'll also circle back around to a reunion with Buckbeak later in this week's reading. And I was concerned that the merpeople had been used, potentially ill-used, in the course of the second task. So I went and I reread that chapter and paid close attention to what we get from the merpeople. And we're actually going to get a slide kind of detailing some of this in just a moment. And my response to the merpeople changed completely. Because when you pay close attention to the Mer people in the context of the second task, what we see is a community, to my reading, which is in a state of festivity, in a state of something approaching celebration. We have songs and we have art and we have the gathering of a community. And then, of course, when the champions return from the lake and emerge onto dry land, they're accompanied by a delegation of Mer people, including the chieftainess, I suppose. So we get this sense that the Mer people aren't just complicit, I suppose, in the second task, but they are actually fulfilling a powerful role in the second task. And that got me thinking about the notion of the Triwizard Tournament in general, and particularly Albus Dumbledore's approach to the Triwizard Tournament. We've talked before somewhat skeptically, somewhat cynically about the recurrence of the Triwizard Tournament here in Harry Potter's fourth year at Hogwarts, and I do believe, I stand by my belief that the Triwizard Tournament and the Wizarding World Cup, which we know was also campaigned for very hard by the Ministry of Magical Sports, I believe that both of these things are, in part at least, a distraction from the looming storm, a distraction from the darkness, from the shadow that has fallen over the Wizarding world. That is thematically actually going to work rather beautifully as we arrive at the end of Goblet of Fire and we move into the rest of the series. But I also think that Albus Dumbledore believes in the power of the Triwizard Tournament to genuinely knit together these different wizarding communities. And by wizarding communities, I suppose I'm talking in a more general sense about magical communities. I think that this is a great opportunity for the staff, for the faculty and student body of Hogwarts, as well as Beauxbaton and Durmstrang, and the wizarding world in general, of course, to draw closer to the Mer people, to create better diplomatic relations, better diplomatic ties with the Mer people. We mustn't forget that Harry is now 3.5 years into his Hogwarts experience, and as far as he knew, there weren't any Mer people living in the Great Lake. That was just an incidental detail which had somehow escaped him. It's not even clear how common that knowledge is. But when I read these excerpts, particularly the constant refrain of Mer people laughing, right? We repeat this beat of Mer people laughing during the second task a handful of times, and it works very powerfully, I think, to speak of a community that is engaged in a certain sense of festivity, a certain kind of festival spirit, a certain sense of engagement and interconnection, which does, I think, speak to the professed goal of the Triwizard Tournament, to foster stronger relations between the three schools, but also, in a more general sense, between different aspects and elements of the wizarding world. What do you guys make of that? Joseph says, I don't really buy the idea that these things are distractions from the coming storm. It's not like Voldy is behind these events so that the people behind the ministry folk have any semblance that darkness is on the way. See, I think that, Joseph, is where you and I might differ just a little. I'm not sure that... I don't think that there is a fixed sense in the wizarding world within the frame of Goblet of Fire that... And I guess when I say the wizarding world, I'm really talking about the ministry. I don't think that there is an understanding inside the ministry at this point that Voldemort is returning. I don't think that there is a sense that actually we're about to face another great wizarding war and things are about to go very, very wrong indeed. But if we look back at Prisoner of Azkaban and we look at the interaction between the ministry and its constituents, I suppose, right? It's the body, the demographic, the population that it has presumably sworn to protect, that it has kind of undertaken the protection and administration of, we can see a certain stress. Legalistic structures are falling by the wayside. That's true at Hogwarts, of course, where, as we've discussed many times now, rule breaking is positively encouraged, but it's also true in the wider wizarding world. Think of, Cornelius Fudge and Harry at the beginning of Prisoner of Azkaban. I think that a shadow has fallen over the wizarding world. And while I say that it is a distraction, while I say that these events are distractions, I don't necessarily mean in an orchestrated kind of propagandistic sense, right? But I do think that there's an element of bread and circuses to both the Quidditch World Cup occurring in England at this time and the Triwizard Tournament occurring in England, in Scotland, I should say, at this time, within the frame of the British Isles. The fluid geography of the British Isles, of course, always complicated to communicate and convey, particularly to those who haven't grown up kind of drawing those very clean distinctions between the British Isles and the United Kingdom and all the constituent parts thereof. It does read to me to be a little bit of populist distraction, but I guess we'll continue to see how that plays out as we move forward. I don't think that any individual person at the ministry or as a part of the wizarding world, in fact, is orchestrating this as a distraction, but I do think that there's a sense that we are entering a dark time. I do think that there's a sense that there is a storm, at least on the horizon, and that things are falling apart in a really interesting way. And as I say, my main point of reference for that is the inclination of the text in Prisoner of Azkaban more even than the text of Goblet of Fire. But perhaps that will be another discussion that we can have more fruitfully at the end of Goblet of Fire and as we move into the rest of the series. Let's get into our Recyclops says the everything is fine meme. No, absolutely. Cornelius Fudge, right? This is fine. This is fine. Yes. Cornelius Fudge is the dog on the dog in the burning house. Absolutely. Yes. All right. Let's Joseph saying too, people have sporting events even when things are going just swimmingly. I mean, I do agree, Joseph, and I can't completely refute your point. You're right. I think that there is, it is entirely possible to read the text in that way. I think that your position is entirely valid. To me, I see a darker implication, and a darker thematic turn, but I may be guilty of a certain amount of transference here, right? I am reading the darker thematic tone of Azkaban and Goblet of Fire, contrasted with the first two books in the series, as being indicative of a turn in the wizarding world, rather than simply being a retcon from J.K. Rowling, right? It is possible that she has reasserted at the beginning of Prisoner of Azkaban that, no, actually the wizarding world is always kind of dark and kind of shady and kind of duplicitous, I suppose, in a way, or at least insincere in some sense, to some degree. It is entirely possible that's just a retcon from J.K. Rowling. I see that as being actually a swing in our understanding of the Wizarding World, that the Wizarding World is itself changing at this point. Thus, we end up with the Quidditch World Cup. Thus, we end up with the Triwizard Tournament. But you're absolutely right. I mean, we do throw sporting events. The Olympics happens no matter what's happening in the rest of the world. The Winter Olympics happens no matter what's happening in the rest of the world. Well, I guess besides some very specific instances during the latter days of the Cold War. But yes, your point is absolutely well taken. Yeah. And Rohit, excuse me. Rohit pointing out here, I wouldn't even call it a retcon. It's just growing maturity in the writing and in Harry's perspective. Yeah, when I say retcon, I don't, God, that's one of those words that's just, retcon is a contraction of retroactive continuity, right? It came out of comic book writing even back in the 1960s, where a new fact would be asserted that superseded an old fact that was true at the time. But the new fact will be the truth going forward. That is a retcon. And you're right, I don't think that J.K. Rowling has actually contradicted herself, but there is to my eye, at least a tonal shift as we move into Prisoner of Azkaban. And as I said at the time, I think that is absolutely indicative of, emblematic of Harry's nascent adolescence and his more adult, his increasingly sophisticated and nuanced worldview, I suppose. But yeah, all of this, of course, can be tagged with a giant pin that we can return to at the end of Goblet of Fire. And as I say, as we move through the rest of the series, let's get into our reading then with picking up from last week, the end of chapter 26, Harry actually rescuing the hostages at the end of the second task here. The shark man swam straight to Hermione and began snapping and biting at her ropes. The trouble was that Crumb's new teeth were positioned very awkwardly for biting anything smaller than a dolphin, and Harry was quite sure that if Crumb wasn't careful, he was going to rip Hermione in half. Darting forward, Harry hit Crumb hard on the shoulder and held up the jagged stone. Crumb seized it and began to cut Hermione free. Within seconds he had done it. He grabbed Hermione around the waist and without a backward glance began to rise rapidly with her toward the surface. Now what? Harry thought desperately. If he could be sure that Fleur was coming, but still no sign. There was nothing to be done except... He snatched up the stone which Crumb had dropped, but the mermen now closed in around Ron and the little girl, shaking their heads at him. Harry pulled out his wand. "Get out of the way!" Only bubbles flew out of his mouth, but he had the distinct impression that the mermen had understood him because they suddenly stopped, laughing. Their yellowish eyes were fixed upon Harry's wand and they looked scared. There might be a lot more of them than there were of him, but Harry could tell by the looks on their faces that they knew no more of magic than the giant squid did. "You've got until 3!" Harry shouted. A great stream of bubbles burst from him, but he held up 3 fingers to make sure they got the message. 1! He put down a finger. 2! He put down a second one. They scattered. Harry darted forward and began to hack at the ropes binding the small girl to the statue, and at last she was free. He seized the little girl around the waist, grabbed the neck of Ron's robes, and kicked off from the bottom. So a couple of really interesting assertions here and a couple of really interesting implications. The assertions include the fact that the mer people do not know magic, and more extravagantly that the giant squid doesn't know anything about magic. I mean, we might speculate that that is true of the giant squid, but still, Harry seems pretty damn certain that that is the case here as he faces down the mer people. What I'm most interested here in, though, is is the action of Victor Crumb. He has inelegantly transmogrified himself, right? He has inelegantly shifted himself into a half shark, which now, of course, I can't think of without thinking of, Moana and Maui's half-hearted attempt at transformation in the course of that movie. So Victor Crumb has full-on Maui'd at this point, shark head indeed. He's trying to snap the ropes away from Hermione, but doing an inelegant job. Harry helps him, of course, because Harry is Harry. He passes him the stone, and Victor takes the stone, cuts the bonds of Hermione's imprisonment, drops the stone, crucially, doesn't even pass it back to Harry, drops it, grabs Hermione, and swims away without a backward glance. And Harry is left then to deal with the greater consequence. What is he going to do with Ron, and what is he going to do with Gabrielle Delacour? Of course, Harry is not going to leave Gabrielle behind. He is going to do the right thing. And we've talked a lot about Harry's exceptionalism. We've talked a lot about Harry's heroism. We've talked a lot about what it is that drives Harry Potter to take the actions that he takes, and what it is that empowers him to do so without the kind of consequence that we would generally associate with those reckless actions, right? We've talked many, many times about the ways in which Harry is basically the designated hero. Everyone in the wizarding world kind of has a sense that it's Harry Potter's name on the cover of the book, right? That he is empowered to take exceptional action. But we forget, I think, too often in that discourse that Harry is a good-hearted boy, that he is a good-hearted young man now, that he is actually heroic. And he is not thinking of the Triwizard Tournament here. He is not thinking of the time limit even. He is concerned. He believes, because of the leverage applied to him by the context of the second task, he believes that Gabrielle Delacour is in imminent mortal danger, and he's not going to leave her behind. This is, well, as we'll see in a couple of slides' time, this is moral fiber of the highest order. So he takes up the stone, and the mermen move back in around Ron. Interestingly, too, here's another implication for you. The mer people in this community must have been told about the champions. They are able to recognize Harry and tell Harry which of the hostages is his, or at least warn Harry off when he is trying to rescue Hermione in the first instance, right? So they know Harry, and they know that Harry is for Ron and for no one else. They are able to engage with the second task in accordance with its rules, right? And this is one of the things that made me think that the mer people are not, in fact, simply an obstacle to be overcome, but are fulfilling a role within the context of the second task, within the context of the Triwizard Tournament in general. They are complicit in the execution of this task because they are honoring the rules, the arbitrary rules that have been set in place by Ludo Bagman and all of the other judges of the Triwizard Tournament. In any case, Harry pulls out his wand. He threatens them with physical harm. This is a moment of great courage and of great bravery for our protagonist here. And he finally, after scaring them away with the threat of imminent violence and presumably boiling jets of water, right? We're going to get a little recreation of his run-in with the Grindylows here, I'm sure. He scares them away. He rescues Gabrielle. He rescues Ron. He kicks off from the bottom. And while swimming back up, his gillyweed runs out. He finds that he can no longer breathe the water. He finds that he is growing colder by the moment, and he desperately surges forward. Harry Potter does not quit. This is another primary characteristic that we associate with the protagonist of this series. He bursts through the surface of the water. He finds himself back in the company of his fellows. Ron chastises him for wasting time with heroism, assuring him that no one was going to be harmed, that everything was going to be just fine. You didn't waste your time being a hero, did you? And then we get to the awarding of the points. The judges went into a huddle. Madame Pomfrey had gone to rescue Ron from Percy's clutches. She led him over to Harry and the others, gave him a blanket and some pepper-up potion, and then went to fetch Fleur and her sister. Fleur had many cuts on her face and arms, and her robes were torn, but she didn't seem to care, nor would she allow Madame Pomfrey to clean them. "Look after Gabrielle," she told her, and then she turned to Harry. "You saved her," she said breathlessly, "even though she was not your hostage." "Yeah," said Harry, who was now heartily wishing he'd left all three girls tied to the statue. Fleur bent down, kissed Harry twice on each cheek. He felt his face burn and wouldn't have been surprised if steam was coming out of his ears again, then said to Ron, "And you too, you helped." "Yeah," said Ron, looking extremely hopeful. "Yeah, a bit." Fleur swooped down on him too and kissed him. Hermione looked simply furious. But just then, Ludo Bagman's magically magnified voice boomed out beside them, making them all jump and causing the crowd in the stands to go very quiet. Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached our decision. Chieftainess Mercus has told us exactly what happened on the bottom of the lake, and we have therefore decided to award marks out of 50 for each of the champions as follows. Fleur Delacour, though she demonstrated excellent use of the bubblehead charm, was attacked by Grindylows as she approached her goal and failed to retrieve her hostage. We award her 25 points. Applause from the stands. I deserved 0, said Fleur throatily, shaking her magnificent head. Shaking her magnificent head. She swoops, she glides, she sails, she shakes her magnificent head. Of course, just... Now that I've seen it, I can't unsee it, and now that I can't unsee it, I have no choice but to celebrate it and love every verb that is given to Fleur Delacour in the course of this book. It's just fantastic. J.K. Rowling's very subtle recognition of her villain nature, I suppose, of her beauty, of her grace, of her charm, whatever it is just lovely and utterly consistent throughout the book. It's a wonder to behold. We get this moment then of Hermione being furious when Fleur kisses Ron, thanking him for his role in all that has occurred at the bottom of the lake. And this also ties back to a discussion that we had briefly last week, right at the end of last week's session. We were speculating about whether or not the crowd could see anything that had happened at the bottom of the lake, whether they had, I don't know, some Palantirs that they had borrowed from Middle-earth that were capable of scrying out to the bottom of the lake. Turns out not. No, actually, the crowd had no idea what was going on, which is why we need Chieftainess Mercus to come up and inform the judges of Harry's special action. There are, of course, 5 judges who are present. There are 5 judges for the Triwizard Tournament. We get Karkaroff, we get Madame Maxime, we get Albus Dumbledore, we get Ludo Bagman, and we get Percy Weasley standing in for the absent Barty Crouch, which presumably means, given what we get on the very next slide, in fact, as points are awarded to Cedric and Harry and Victor alongside them, which presumably means that each of the judges is allowed to award up to 10 points. All of the judges have split the uprights with regard to Fleur. She executes the bubblehead charm apparently perfectly, and then gets caught up with Grindylows and can't make it to the hostage in time. So she gets kind of a participation ribbon. She does not complete the task. She does not complete the task as it was set to her, but nonetheless, she gets a certain number of points. And Fleur is, by this point, clearly, struggling with the Triwizard Tournament. She's just not standing up to the other champions here. Let's move on to the next slide and take a look at the other scores. Cedric Diggory, who also used the bubblehead charm, was first to return with his hostage, though he returned 1 minute outside the time limit of an hour. Enormous cheers from the Hufflepuffs in the crowd. Harry saw Cho give Cedric a glowing look. We therefore award him 47 points. Harry's heart sank. If Cedric had been outside the time limit, he most certainly had been. Victor Crumb used an incomplete form of transfiguration, which was nevertheless effective, and was second to return with his hostage. We award him 40 points. Karkaroff clapped particularly hard, looking very superior. Harry Potter used gillyweed to great effect, Bagman continued. He returned last and well outside of the time limit of an hour. However, the Merchieftainess informs us that Mr. Potter was first to reach the hostages, and that the delay in his return was due to his determination to return all hostages to safety, not merely his own. Ron and Hermione both gave Harry half-exasperated, half-commiserating looks. Most of the judges, and here Bagman gave Karkaroff a very nasty look, feel that this shows moral fibre and merits full marks. However, Mr. Potter's score is 45 points. Harry's stomach leapt. He was now tying for first place with Cedric. Ron and Hermione, caught by surprise, stared at Harry, then laughed and started applauding hard with the rest of the crowd. There you go, Harry, Ron shouted over the noise. You weren't being thick after all. You were showing moral fibre. Moral fibre. You didn't win, Harry. You didn't, actually, fundamentally, complete the task. But you broke the rules in a way that bespeaks great heroism. You broke the rules in a way that, or failed to complete the task set to you in a way that bespeaks great moral fibre, and broke the rules, i.e. rescuing another hostage in a way that bespeaks great moral fibre, right? Harry, you really Gryffindored your way through this particular problem, didn't you? You really Gryffindored the hell out of the second task. And the reason that I mention the 5 judges is that we can actually look very nicely at what Karkaroff has done here. Karkaroff has presumably awarded Harry 5 points. Exactly the same amount that he gave to Fleur, which is at least a diplomatic position. Fleur did not complete the task. Harry did not complete the task. Thus, they both get 5 out of a possible 10 points from each judges. Ludo Bagman says, most of the judges feel that this shows moral fibre and merits full marks. Most of the judges, except Karkaroff. That means that Dumbledore and Madame Maxime obviously. I think Madame Maxime would be pretty well disposed to Harry at this point, even after the relative lack of success of the Beauxbatons champion in this instance. So Dumbledore, Madame Maxime, Ludo Bagman himself, and Percy Weasley have all given 10 points to Harry, and Karkaroff has given him the diplomatic bare minimum, right? He can't very well give Harry fewer points than Fleur, since Fleur failed to complete the task, so he gives him the obligatory 5. To do any less would be impolitic, would be treacherously close to an insult, I would imagine, right? Since Fleur has already been established as failing to complete the task, completely. There is, of course, an argument here. #millennials. Fleur gets half the score for not completing the task, at all, and Harry here manages to turn the breaking of the rules and the breaking of expectations and the partial completion of the task by the standard set into not just a technical victory, not a technical victory. Okay, he comes in second in this challenge, second to Cedric, of course, but he is now in joint first place in the Triwizard Tournament overhaul. He has managed to parlay this into a technical victory of a sort, but also, much more importantly, a moral victory. Harry's heroism, his moral fiber, has guided him once again to do the right thing, and that right thing has been rewarded by the Wizarding world, and this is in really interesting tension with what we were discussing last week, what we've been discussing throughout Goblet of Fire, what we were discussing all the way through Prisoner of Azkaban 2, I dare say, about the observance of the rules. Not everyone can break the rules and get away with it. Not everyone can break the rules and be rewarded for it, but Harry can, because Harry has that special exceptionalism. Yeah, good. It Don't Connect is leaving us just a little early tonight. Oh, good luck with your exam tomorrow at Don't Connect. I hope that it all works out very well for you. Yes. Lady De Winter saying, considering Percy's love of the rules, I'm surprised he gave Harry full points. I was thinking about that too, Lady De Winter. I like to think of Percy here taking very seriously his role as a representative of Barty Crouch, right? That he is not a judge in his own right. He is actually speaking on behalf of a man who he holds in the highest esteem, and to criticize Harry for failing to perform the task according to the rules while demonstrating this great moral fiber, particularly, the pressure there from Ludo Bagman and from Albus Dumbledore, if not the others too. I like to think of Percy here translating what he believes Mr. Crouch would have wanted in this particular instance. But yeah, and it may be... We may be, speculating erroneously here. It may be that most of the judges, and here Bagman gave Karkaroff a very nasty look, feel that this shows moral fiber and merits full marks. However, Mr. Potter's score is 45 points. It's possible that Percy gave him 8 points and that Karkaroff actually gave him 7 points. We don't know that for sure. It's possible that Ludo Bagman just is favoring Karkaroff with an ill look rather than also looking at Percy at the same time. We don't know for sure, but that is certainly my speculation, that the 4 judges give Harry absolutely full marks, but Karkaroff gives him the same as we might infer everyone gave to Fleur. That seems to work mathematically for me. Let's look, in fact, at the last slide from this chapter and at moral fiber. Yes, the Dry Heaving Llama saying Percy's thought process. When a judge, do as the other judges do. Then they'll accept you as a judge. Absolutely right? Percy wants nothing more than conventionality. He wants nothing more than to fit in with his peer group. And the fact that his peer group is Albus Dumbledore and Madame Maxime, I mean, yeah, he's going to be inclined, I think, to follow their lead. I would suspect, in fact, that Percy has given the mean score in every single round of this tournament. Yeah, I think he gave the mean score to each of the competitors here. One of the best things... Oh, I'm sorry. This is actually... Look, I guess I don't have that slide. I do apologize, you guys. I guess I contracted 2 slides into one. So we're actually just going to move on to chapter 27 here with Ron's moment in the limelight, right? One of the best things about the aftermath of the second task was that everyone was very keen to hear details of what had happened down in the lake, which meant that Ron was getting to share Harry's limelight for once. Harry noticed that Ron's version of events changed subtly with every retelling. At first, he gave what seemed to be the truth. It tallied with Hermione's story anyway. Dumbledore had put all of the hostages into a bewitched sleep in Professor McGonagall's office, first assuring them that they would be quite safe and that they would awake when they were back above the water. 1 week later, however, Ron was telling a thrilling tale of kidnap in which he struggled single-handedly against 50 heavily armed merpeople who had to beat him into submission before tying him up. "But I had my wand hidden up my sleeve," he assured Padma Patil, who seemed to be a lot keener on Ron now that he was getting so much attention and was making a point of talking to him every time they passed in the corridors. "I could have taken those idiots any time I wanted." "What were you going to do, snore at them?" said Hermione waspishly. People had been teasing her so much about being the thing that Victor Crumb would most miss that she was in a rather tetchy mood. Ron's ears went red, and thereafter he reverted to the bewitched sleep version of events. Ron enjoying his moment in the limelight here, and Harry acknowledging that was the underlying friction, the underlying schism between he and Ron earlier in the book, that Ron was in fact jealous of Harry's notoriety, I suppose, that masculine competitive impulse here in the frame of Hogwarts has manifested itself even between Ron and Harry. But now Ron has a story to tell, and he is telling it in the Weasleyiest way possible, right? We so often forget that Ron is a Weasley through and through. There is an excerpt later in tonight's reading when he observes the reality of leprechaun gold and the fact that it fades away, and he chastises Harry for not pointing out that the leprechaun gold that Ron gave to him back at the Quidditch World Cup had in fact disappeared. And Harry said, "Well, I didn't know there were other things going on." And Ron finally breaks and says, "I hate being poor." And it's a moment of real emotional weight and real emotional gravitas there, I suppose. And Ron complains. He understands why Fred and George want to continue making money, right? He understands this entrepreneurial instinct with which his older brothers are affected or afflicted, I suppose. But Ron is so often represented as a part of the power trio first and a Weasley as a distant second that these Weasley-ish moments are actually, for me, rather charming and rather heartwarming. And that is not to say that, of course, expanding on the story, that developing the details of the story, that making it more dramatic and more impressive, particularly to Padma Patil, who is now so much more impressed with Ron than she used to be and is taking the opportunity to talk to him every time they pass in the corridor. Like, this is pretty great. Ron, who struggled to get a date to the Yule Ball, is now kind of a celebrity. He's kind of a notable figure here in the halls at Hogwarts for the first time, at least for the first time in a good way, right? The most that he has ever received before is, "Oh, you're Harry Potter's friend. You pal around with the boy who lived." That's pretty impressive. But now Ron has a story all his own. So of course he's exaggerating it and he's expanding it. This is a typically adolescent thing to do, and Hermione is pushing back against that, both with her waspish remark, "What were you going to do, snore at them?" But also you'll note how Hermione is held up as a figure of truth, a speaker of true things. Harry noticed that Ron's version of events changed subtly with every retelling. At first he gave what seemed to be the truth. It tallied with Hermione's story anyway. Well, that's Hermione's story. She's not going to embellish it. She's not going to exaggerate it. So of course, Hermione's story is the truth, or as close as we are going to get to the truth, at least. So this is Ron's moment in the limelight, but a shadow is going to fall over them again. Of course, a shadow caused by a Rita Skeeter. Let's get right to Harry Potter's secret heartache. "A boy like no other, perhaps, yet a boy suffering all the usual pangs of adolescence," writes Rita Skeeter. "Deprived of love since the tragic demise of his parents, 14-year-old Harry Potter thought he had found solace in his steady girlfriend at Hogwarts, Muggle-born Hermione Granger. Little did he know that he would shortly be suffering yet another emotional blow in a life already littered with personal loss. Miss Granger, a plain but ambitious girl, seems to have a taste for famous wizards that Harry alone cannot satisfy. Since the arrival at Hogwarts of Victor Crumb, Bulgarian seeker and hero of the last World Quidditch Cup, Miss Granger has been toying with both boys' affections. Crumb, who was openly smitten with the devious Miss Granger, has already invited her to visit him in Bulgaria over the summer holidays and insists that he has, quote, never felt this way about any other girl. However, it might not be Miss Granger's doubtful natural charms that have captured these unfortunate boys' interest. She's really ugly, says Pansy Parkinson, a pretty and vivacious fourth-year student, but she'd be well up to making a love potion. She's quite brainy. I think that's how she's doing it. Love potions are, of course, banned at Hogwarts, and no doubt Albus Dumbledore will want to investigate these claims. In the meantime, Harry Potter's well-wishers must hope that next time he bestows his heart on a worthier candidate." This is followed, we'll talk about the text of this in just one moment, but this is followed by Ron's pretty brilliant concern that Hermione is being painted as a Scarlet Woman, which is both fantastically adolescent and fantastically middle-aged, and just another great reminder that Molly Weasley is the best of us. Molly Weasley is a very, very good woman indeed. So let's look at how Rita Skeeter is conducting herself in this next odious campaign against the fine folks of Hogwarts. A boy like no other, perhaps this has of course given us our title for tonight's session, A Boy Like No Other. A boy like no other perhaps, yet a boy suffering all the usual pangs of adolescence, writes Rita Skeeter. So, in the very first instance, we recognize Harry's exceptionalism. Harry is unusual, a boy like no other, but teenage heartbreak afflicts us all. And then we're going to pivot, of course, because this isn't about ubiquity and inevitability of teenage heartbreak. It's about how awful Hermione is as a character, right? Deprived of love since the tragic demise of his parents, 14-year-old Harry Potter thought he had found solace in his steady girlfriend at Hogwarts, Muggle-born Hermione Granger. And you'll note, as we discussed last time in the Hagrid story which appeared in the Daily Prophet, that part of Rita Skeeter's arsenal here is the quiet assertion. The quiet assertion that sits in the middle of a dependent subclause and yet carries great weight. She begs questions left and right. He had found solace in his steady girlfriend at Hogwarts, Muggle-born Hermione Granger. Little did he know he would shortly be suffering yet another emotional blow in a life already littered with personal loss. Miss Granger, a plain but ambitious girl. So she's plain at this point, right? Plain but ambitious. Also something of which we might be suspicious, though you'll note that when we reference Pansy Parkinson, we describe her as a pretty and vivacious fourth-year student, not a pretty and vivacious fourth-year Slytherin student, you'll note, right? We don't want to muddy the waters. We want to keep things nice and simple and elemental. So Pansy gets to be pretty and Hermione gets to be plain or outright ugly. She's really ugly, says Pansy Parkinson, a pretty and vivacious fourth-year student. This is, I mean, we must, of course, acknowledge the superficial level on which this is utterly gross, you know, the way in which we are concerned about the relative attractiveness of these teenage girls. This is thoroughly unpleasant, and yet, of course, completely consistent with, well, Rita Skeeter's journalism in the wizarding world and gutter tabloid journalism in the real world, too, right? Where we're not at all above the marking of the physical attributes of public figures who are, well, of public figures, period. End of sentence, end of thought, end of conclusion, right? But also of public figures who are younger than might be otherwise accepted, right? We can think about the recent discussions which have happened in public spaces about the cast of Stranger Things, for example, or, you know, I remember, gosh, it must have been 15 years ago now, a lot of very unsavory speculation regarding the singer Charlotte Church, who rose to fame when she was underage, when she was very young indeed. In fact, I think she maybe rose to fame when she was 14, and that did not stop the tabloid press from rhapsodizing about how beautiful and attractive she was. It's thoroughly unpleasant and manifested beautifully here by J.K. Rowling, though it's one of these things that she actually gets so right that it makes me feel a little uncomfortable. It makes me a little mad at the prose of the book because it is so on point, because it is so absolutely accurate here. Miss Granger, a plain but ambitious girl, seems to have a taste for famous wizards that Harry alone cannot satisfy. Again, utterly begging the question, right? Utterly begging the question that there's a long-standing relationship between Harry and Hermione, that she is plain but ambitious, and that she has this thirst for the fellowship and the companionship of notable wizards of her generation. Since the arrival at Hogwarts of Victor Crumb, Bulgarian seeker and hero of the last World Quidditch Cup, hero of a sporting event, is also a classically British tabloid gutter, you know, awful bit of phrasing there. It's just terrible. Miss Granger has been toying with both boys' affections. Crumb, who was openly smitten with the devious Miss Granger, you'll note again all of these adjectives just coming in, never challenged, never questioned, just absolutely, you know, asserting an implicit conclusion about Hermione, which you would be a fool not to agree with, right? You'd have to be some kind of crazy person to read this and question the conclusions which Rita Skeeter is laying out for you so painstakingly. Had already invited her to visit him in Bulgaria over the summer holidays and insists that he has, quote, never felt this way about any other girl. However, it might not be Miss Granger's doubtful natural charms that have captured these unfortunate boys' interests. And then we start talking about love potions, because of course it's not enough for Hermione to be devious. She also has to be plain. She also has to be cheating, right? This idea that she is somehow breaking the rules, this idea that she is somehow violating the social contract here at Hogwarts, the actual rules of Hogwarts too. And you'll note the urge there for Albus Dumbledore to raise the standard on behalf of Rita Skeeter, on behalf of the outraged readers of Witches Weekly, right? On behalf of these just awful, awful people. They're trying to get Albus Dumbledore on side. We get that implicit appeal to authority, which we had back in the Hagrid piece too. All of which is to say that this is vile. But what's brilliant about it is the way that it is immediately rejected. It is only when Severus Snape reads the article aloud, apparently in its entirety, leaving dramatic pauses for the Slytherin students to guffaw with laughter, that Hermione begins to really feel it. She begins to feel it not in the abstract, because Hermione has, well, a very strong sense of who she is and what she is. In the abstract, this is nothing. This is just a lie told about her by people out there in the world, right? Hermione would have been very good at Twitter, I suppose, is what I'm saying, right? Because people are going to tell lies about you on the internet. People are going to cast aspersions at you and be critical of you on the internet. And you have to develop a thick skin. You have to be so sure in yourself and in what is actually true and what is actually right that you don't need to rise to that challenge, that you don't need to respond to those allegations. You can simply be yourself. It is when the abstract becomes personal, when the impersonal becomes personal, that Hermione begins to get affected. And of course, that is in large part because there it is given the voice of Severus Snape. For all that he is a villain, Snape is still a professor at Hogwarts. And that betrayal of his position, the betrayal of his authority over Hermione, seems to be one of those things which breaks her heart most powerfully, most effectively. JY says here in the chat, damn Snape for reading lies aloud in class. Absolutely agreed. And Rayla Lynn saying, this is when I truly start to loathe Rita. This is truly where she crosses the line. Everything that happens to Hermione because of this. And I couldn't pull them, you guys. I just couldn't pull the slides. Everything that happens to Hermione in the rest of this book is just... is foul. It's just foul. It's very true is the thing. It's very realistic, I suppose, but it's genuinely awful. Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think Rita Skeeter has already passed beyond the moral event horizon with her hit piece on Hagrid and her outright bigotry against giants and against, non-humans in general, right? It's pretty much... It's pretty much a polemic against foreigners, I suppose, would be the real world tabloid journalism version of that. But Rita Skeeter has, for me at least, already crossed the moral event horizon. But this is, I think, categorically so much worse. This is a whole different order of evil. She is just genuinely, genuinely terrible. Yes, Raven pointing out the bigotry slips in here, singling her out as Muggleborn. Of course, she's Muggleborn, right? I'm amazed that we don't use the mudblood word here in this article. It's just, Rita Skeeter, of course, would never use the word mudblood in a piece of journalistic prose, but she could absolutely find someone to whom she could attribute that as a quote. I'm surprised that doesn't come up in Pansy Parkinson's quote, to be completely honest. Yeah. Okay, let's, Rita Skeeter says Recyclops is right out of Fox News. Absolutely right. Yes. And Wilhelm scream, bigotry against giants, little tree against house elves. Yes, correct. Excellent. Wilhelm asking, this is interesting. Has Rowling left mudblood behind at this point? Yes, maybe. At least the casual use of mudblood. I'm now struggling to think of another instance of mudblood appearing in the pages of Harry Potter. She may have left it behind at this point. Yes, I know that we do transition away from it at some point, but yeah, it does definitely come up after, says Ruhit. I can't put my finger on exactly when, but yes, anyway, all of this is to say that Rita Skeeter is the absolute worst. And it's all the worse for Hermione, for Harry, for Ron, because they're in Snape's class at the time. They're in their potions class at the time. Snape separates them, brings Harry right up to the front, and then delivers, wow, just a very creepy and ominous veiled threat here. I haven't been anywhere near your office, said Harry angrily, forgetting his feigned deafness. Don't lie to me, Snape hissed, his fathomless black eyes boring into Harry's boomslang skin. Gillyweed. Both came from my private stores, and I know who stole them. Harry stared back at Snape, determined not to blink or look guilty. In truth, he hadn't stolen either of these things from Snape. Hermione had taken the boomslang skin back in their second year. They'd needed it for the Polyjuice potion, and while Snape had suspected Harry at the time, he had never been able to prove it. Dobby, of course, had stolen the gillyweed. I don't know what you're talking about, Harry lied coldly. You were out of bed on the night my office was broken into, Snape hissed. I know it, Potter. Now Mad-Eye Moody might have joined your fan club, but I will not tolerate your behavior. One more nighttime stroll into my office, Potter, and you will pay. Right, said Harry coolly, turning back to his ginger roots. I'll bear that in mind if I ever get the urge to go in there. Snape's eyes flashed. He plunged a hand into the inside of his black robes. For one wild moment, Harry thought Snape was about to pull out his wand and curse him. Then he saw that Snape had drawn out a small crystal bottle of a completely clear potion. Harry stared at it. Do you know what this is, Potter? Snape said, his eyes glittering dangerously again. No, said Harry, with complete honesty this time. It is Veritaserum, a truth potion, so powerful that 3 drops would have you spilling your innermost secrets for this entire class to hear, said Snape viciously. Now, the use of this potion is controlled by very strict ministry guidelines. But unless you watch your step, you might just find that my hand slips. He shook the crystal bottle slightly, right over your evening pumpkin juice. And then, Potter, then we'll find out whether you've been in my office or not. While we're talking about people passing beyond the moral event horizon, by the way, hey, here's Severus Snape taking some time out from his potions class to threaten Harry with a gross invasion of privacy, to threaten Harry with something which is not completely different from the unforgivable curses, right? He is threatening to wield the Veritaserum potion, the Veritaserum substance, I suppose, the Veritaserum serum against Harry in direct violation of ministry guidelines. And he doesn't need to say that, right? Severus Snape does not need to say to Harry, this is wildly against the law, but I'm going to do it anyway. Like, you need to watch your step, Potter, because I am more than willing to break the law and presumably invite suspension, if not an outright sacking from Hogwarts here, right? I am completely willing to do what I have to do to threaten you here. Is Snape telling the truth? Would he ever actually cross that line? Well, who can say? But he's certainly assuring Harry that this is the case. He doesn't need to. He is emphasizing to Harry that nothing is going to stop him in his pursuit of what he alleges to be a kind of justice. And Harry's moral position here is somewhat complicated, of course, because Harry wasn't in Snape's office, he didn't steal the boomslang skein, and he didn't steal the gillyweed. But he knows about all of those things. He knows about all of those events, and he knows about those events because he was also at the time breaking other school rules that Snape would presumably be very, very interested in. It is to Harry's infinite credit, I think, that when he's thinking about the Veritaserum potion right after this beat, he's thinking first of the trouble that Hermione would get into and the trouble that Dobby would get into, and of course, Sirius Black, and all of the other many, many secrets that Harry has enclosed within his chest that he refuses to impart, particularly to people like Severus Snape. This is, this makes for difficult reading, right? The outright hostility, the outright viciousness of Severus Snape with regard to Harry isn't anything new per se, but this is colder. And Snape breaking from the traditional role that he has occupied in the Harry Potter novels is something new, is something notable, right? Because he has always represented that kind of tyrannical and dictatorial authority. He has represented the dark face of authority within the bounds of Hogwarts. Dumbledore is perhaps, well, no, okay, Dumbledore is not, because Dumbledore has at least a passing disinterest in the rules of Hogwarts. Minerva McGonagall is the white face of authority at Hogwarts, whereas Snape is the blackface. Yeah, I'm just thinking of this like this Janus kind of two-headed god of authority here within the bounds of Hogwarts, the light and dark, if you will. Minerva McGonagall enforces the rules, but does so out of a sense of duty, out of a sense of justice, out of a sense of compassion and consistency paired. She is a good and noble exemplar of justice here in the frame of Hogwarts. Snape has never been that. He will absolutely abuse the rules in order to pursue his personal vendetta against Harry and his broader vendetta against everyone who isn't Slytherin, I suppose, right? He has been seen to abuse the rules anyway, right? We opened this passage with him snatching 10 points away from Gryffindor because Hermione's talking about all that she's enduring, and then another 10 points because they're reading the magazine beneath the desk. And everyone in the room is sure that he's building up to take around 50 points away from Gryffindor in the span of a single class. He's absolutely not above it. And indeed, he revels in the abuse of his own authority. But that authority is derived from the legalistic structure of Hogwarts in the first place. Now he is stepping beyond that even. And not even beyond the legalistic structure of Hogwarts, but rather the legalistic structure of the wizarding world. Now, the use of this potion, he says, is controlled by very strict ministry guidelines, but unless you watch your step, you might just find that my hand slips right over your evening pumpkin juice. I will break the law, Harry, to screw you over at this point. I will break the law to get to the truth. And, well, yes, I mean, tangentially, just parenthetically, to completely destroy your life, Potter. That is my goal. This is absolutely a betrayal of what Snape stands for, but it also speaks to that larger theme that we've discussed before of the crumbling edifices of the wizarding world. The ministry is shaky now upon its foundations, right? The faculty of Hogwarts is shaky upon its foundations. Has been ever since Prisoner of Azkaban, in fact. Everything that Harry knows about the wizarding world, he now has no reason to believe that actually the world is just. Actually the world is good. He has no reason to believe that the arc of the universe bends toward justice, right? He is being shown that there is corruption and self-indulgence everywhere, and that those figures who actually do seem to stand for justice, Minerva McGonagall, stern but compassionate, Albus Dumbledore, scatterbrained but generous and kind and forgiving, and most interestingly in the frame of this book, of course, Mad-Eye Moody, the paranoid ex-Auror who is taking nothing from no one, right? He is absolutely not willing to engage in the niceties and formalities of polite society. He is pretty much an exile from polite wizarding society, in fact, but he is representative of a kind of moral rule breaking, which still, for all that we can support that, and I'm talking about how we perceive Moody from Harry's POV at this point in the book, of course, where he has been pretty firmly established as being the anti-Snape, I suppose. Even Moody is breaking down the rules, and every time someone breaks the rules with impunity or breaks the rules with consequence, right? Every time a rule is broken, that rule is weakened. That is why legalistic structures have to be enforced with punitive penalties. That is why we in the real world, I'm talking about real societies as well as the fictional societies of J.K. Rowling's subcreation here. Even in the real world, when a rule no longer stands for something, then it might as well not be a rule. It just becomes obsolete. It becomes a shadow of its former self. And that is happening all over the place in the wizarding world. Again, going right the way back to Azkaban, going right the way back to, what is our first instance of that? I suppose Cornelius Fudge hand-waving the whole Aunt Marge incident, right? That's probably the first instance where we're like, hey, wait, though, there are definite rules in place to punish Harry for what he did, like multiple rules in place for punishing Harry for what he did. Oh, we're just going to hand-wave those? Okay. I'm sure everything's fine at the ministry. I'm sure everything's fine in the wizarding world. I'm sure there is no, looming shadow on the horizon that is going to tug the world back into darkness once more. Yeah. Yeah, Becca's saying, I want Snape fired so bad. Yeah, no kidding. No kidding. Yeah, Brendan saying Snape is also feeling threatened because he knows people are breaking into his office. He's acting out in his own way, even if it is unethical. It just makes me dislike him more. Right. No, he's vulnerable, and his vulnerability is making him, and I'm not using vulnerability here in the sense in which I usually use the word vulnerability, which is very positive. He is open to allegation and assault now. He is his experience, at least, is uncontrolled in a way that is clearly difficult for Snape, and he is trying to reassert that control by breaking the rules. The implicit moral rules of his position at Hogwarts, the actual rules, the implicit moral rules of his position at Hogwarts being, you're a professor. Teach kids. Don't use your class as a means of conducting your personal vendetta against these specific children. That is wildly unethical. That breaks the moral framework of your position. He's betraying and abusing that. He's betraying and abusing the rule structure at Hogwarts, and he's betraying and abusing, or at least threatening to betray and abuse, the actual law of the wizarding world. Snape is, again, a genuinely awful character, right? A really problematic figure, a malevolent and evil figure in the prose at this point. But what I'm most interested in is the way that willingness to break the rules, that willingness to subvert his own role, that willingness to pursue his personal agenda is both singularly and individually corruptive, but also indicative of this fall, this decline that seems to be afflicting the wizarding world as we move forward. Let's look at Karkaroff and Snape. Karkaroff, of course, breaks into the potions class halfway through, demands Snape's attention. Snape forestalls him until the class is over. Harry spills his armadillo bile and is cleaning it up while Snape and Karkaroff talk. This very brief scene here. "What's so urgent?" he heard Snape hiss at Karkaroff. "This," said Karkaroff, and Harry, peering around the edge of his cauldron, saw Karkaroff pull up the left-hand sleeve of his robe and show Snape something on his inner forearm. "Well," said Karkaroff, still making every effort not to move his lips, "do you see? It's never been this clear, never since—" "Put it away," snarled Snape, his black eyes sweeping the classroom. "But you must have noticed," Karkaroff began in an agitated voice. "We can talk later, Karkaroff," spat Snape. "Potter, what are you doing?" "Clearing up my armadillo bile, Professor," said Harry innocently, straightening up and showing Snape the sodden rag he was holding. Karkaroff turned on his heel and strode out of the dungeon. He looked both worried and angry, not wanting to remain alone with an exceptionally angry Snape. Harry threw his books and ingredients back into his bag and left at top speed to tell Ron and Hermione what he had just witnessed. Another reference to the left arm, of course, when Moody confronted Snape during Harry's post-bath-time nocturnal adventures in the halls of Hogwarts. When Moody confronts Snape, Snape too grabs his left arm. There was clearly some kind of commonality between Snape and Karkaroff at this point, and Mad-Eye Moody knows what is up. We can only speculate at this point. What is happening here? Yeah. Sarah has a really interesting question here. What is Snape's purpose in threatening Harry, though? He's basically warning Harry, which strikes me as unsubtle and unslytherin. It feels a little like the evil villain rubbing his palms, talking about their plans. I can definitely see that, Sarah. I don't think at all that you are wrong there. It is lacking in elegance. It is not as sophisticated a plan as we might expect from Snape. But then Snape, with regard to Harry in particular, has never been terribly sophisticated. Snape seems to be relying on his other great skill, his other great quality as, the head of Slytherin and as the potions master at Hogwarts and as an adult in a world of children, which is not actually his sly skill with the plot. We're going to be assured by Sirius Black in the pages to come, in fact, that Sirius Black is plenty smart enough to get off the hook after the Death Eaters were all rounded up. Like, even if he had been working for Voldemort, and hey, who knows on that score, he's plenty smart enough to avoid a trip to Azkaban, right? He is sly and he is capable, but he's also capable and capable of and more than willing to rely upon his ability to intimidate, I suppose, right? He is asserting his authority so powerfully, so forcefully, that he apparently believes that Harry is going to be cowed by it and that Harry is not going to pursue his current course, that he is going to stay out of Snape's way. And we might, if we have read the entire series, infer a detail from that is very interesting. This is absolutely one of the points which at the end of the series we're going to be able to revisit with a certain amount of additional information and perhaps look more closely and more scrupulously at Snape's actions here. Gosh, I'm catching up with a lot of scrolling here in the chat. You guys are awfully chatty tonight. Yes, Raven Darkholm saying, "Before I kill you, Mr. Potter, I must tell you my plans." Yes, very good. He does have that kind of James Bond villain quality, doesn't he? Yeah. Okay, let's keep pushing on. I was just thinking how terrible it is that Alan Rickman never got the chance to play a villain in James Bond, and then I remember that Die Hard exists, and he basically did, in fact. So, yeah. Alan Rickman. Too sad. So that is Karkaroff and Snape. This brings us to our transition in this chapter. Harry and Ron and Hermione set out on their Hogsmeade excursion, their little Rumspringa here to Hogsmeade, but pass right through the village, finding Padfoot, who leads them to a cave concealed in the mountains. And hey, you guys, Sirius Black is back. Sirius was wearing ragged grey robes, the same ones he'd been wearing when he left Azkaban. His black hair was longer than it had been when he'd appeared in the fire, and it was untidy and matted once more. He looked very thin. "Chicken," he said hoarsely after removing the old Daily Prophets from his mouth and throwing them down on the cave floor. Harry pulled open his bag and handed over the bundle of chicken legs and bread. "Thanks," said Sirius, opening it, grabbing a drumstick, sitting down on the cave floor and tearing off a large chunk with his teeth. "I've been living off rats, mostly. Can't steal too much food from Hogsmeade. I draw attention to myself." He grinned up at Harry, but Harry returned the grin only reluctantly. "What are you doing here, Sirius?" he said. "Fulfilling my duty as godfather," said Sirius, gnawing on the chicken bone in a very dog-like way. "Don't worry about it. I'm pretending to be a lovable stray." He was still grinning, but seeing the anxiety in Harry's face, said more seriously, I want to be on the spot. Your last letter, well, let's just say things are getting fishier. I've been stealing the paper every time someone throws one out, and by the looks of things, I'm not the only one who's getting worried. He nodded at the yellowing Daily Prophets on the cave floor, and Ron picked them up and unfolded them. Harry, however, continued to stare at Sirius. What if they catch you? What if you're seen? You three and Dumbledore are the only ones around here who know I'm an animagus, said Sirius, shrugging and continuing to devour the chicken leg. So Sirius is back, and he is suffering. He is thin. His hair is long and matted. He has been on the road. He has been masquerading as a lovable stray, which is a great comedic beat from Sirius there, because he is concerned about, well, everything that's going on in the wizarding world, right? He knows, as Dumbledore knows, that something is up, that something is going on. He's unaware of the nature of that, but we're going to spend, pretty much the rest of the chapter trying to draw some connections, trying to make some new assertions, offering some new exposition. This is, I suppose, I like this scene very much, actually, but in the context of this chapter, where we've just had a lot of exposition from Snape. We've had, Rita Skeeter's article, first of all, then a lot of Snape, and now a lot of Sirius Black. We're not really advancing the plot that much. I said last time that this week's entire reading, in fact, consists of people sitting around and trying to untangle the plot while Hermione says, no, you definitely can't disapparate from the grounds of Hogwarts. And that is perhaps an exaggeration, right? We also introduce the third task at the end of the following chapter, and we do move some of our plots forward significantly, but there is a lot of exposition, and combining the Snape scene with the Sirius Black scene does rob this chapter of a certain amount of momentum, even though I do enjoy both scenes. I think that structurally here, the book is not putting its best foot forward, and that is going to be compounded in a really weird way by the sudden rapidity and pace of the plot when we hit the next chapter. We're going to fast forward pretty damn hard in the near future here in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, because we're observing that academic year structure that J.K. Rowling has held to now for 4 books in a row. And I'm not sure overall how the structure works. I'm not sure, let me qualify that still further. I am not sure that the structure works. I am not sure that the structure of this plot serves the shape of the book as a whole. It is oftentimes asserted that Goblet of Fire is just too long. I don't necessarily think that Goblet of Fire is just too long, because there are certain aspects of the story which really need that breathing room, really need that space where we're building this brooding sense of tension in a really effective way. The problem is, for me, rather, that the Triwizard Tournament is simply insufficient as a superstructure to hold the plot aloft, if you like. The book is doing too much in too many different places, and we're not really observing a primary kinetic and well-motivated plot thread, I suppose. So this is, I think, one of those points in this book where the action starts to drag. This is one of the chapters, I think, that is oftentimes criticized by people who don't like Goblet of Fire, and I completely see it. For me personally, both of the incidental scenes that we get in this chapter actually work quite well. I love the Snape scene. I really like Sirius Black, you guys. I really like him, and I love the way that he talks to the kids. I love the substance of the exposition that he offers is bordering on the heavy-handed, I would say. It's bordering on the excessive, but it is beautifully written, and it is beautifully constructed, and it is respectful of Harry and Ron and Hermione in a way that I really do appreciate. So let's see how much of that we can get through. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm already past an hour into my time tonight. Well, we might do our best to finish chapter 27 tonight. We may not actually venture into chapter 28 at all, but we will see what we can do. So this is the setup here for Sirius's return. He's been living off rats. He's been scrounging Daily Prophets. He's been trying to keep up with the news. He's been trying to put the pieces together. He has to be here, though, because he has a duty. Fulfilling my duty as godfather, said Sirius, gnawing on the chicken bone in a very dog-like way. Don't worry about it. I'm pretending to be a lovable stray. This is not a point of abstract principle. This is not a point of social principle that is motivating Sirius Black in this book. He is not here because it is the right thing to do. He is not here because he is a capital G, capital W good wizard. He is here because of Harry, because after his experiences in the last days of the Wizarding War, certainly his many long years in Azkaban, after those experiences have stripped him of everything else, what remains is his bond to Harry. This is how he Well, atonement is such a difficult concept, right? Redemption is such a difficult concept for Sirius Black. Is he atoning for his sins? Is he redeeming himself? No, I don't think so. Not entirely. Instead, he has seen his worldview shrink. It used to be the whole world. It used to be his entire society. And step by step, degree by pernicious degree, that was taken from him. That was removed from him. And now all that he has left is Harry. And he has escaped his fate, if you like. He's no longer suffering in Azkaban, but he's also not a free man. He's also not the Sirius Black that he had the potential to be. He is now just this wandering stray. He's just going from place to place in the company of Buckbeak, trying to protect Harry, trying to keep himself safe. Yes, trying to keep Buckbeak safe. Yes, but also trying to protect Harry. And when the rubber hits the road, when the shadows have darkened sufficiently, when things seem imminent, he has, of course, returned to Hogsmeade. He has, of course, returned to Hogwarts itself because he has to be near Harry. He wants to be, on the ground, as it were. Let's get into some exposition here on Barty Crouch as we move into the rest of this chapter. I'm looking here at Sarah in the chat. Harry is the strongest link to Sirius's past, although I suppose Remus could be argued. Sirius has no way to integrate into the Wizarding world, no place at the moment. Absolutely right. Beautifully put, Sarah. I think you're right on it there. Everything else has been taken from him. Harry cannot be taken from him. Or I suppose the only way that Harry could be taken from him is if Harry himself rejected that bond, rejected that connection. But Harry rather leaned into that connection, right? Is very fond of Sirius and very genuine in his regard and affection for Sirius Black. So that bond endures, and that bond is all that Sirius has left. Let's talk about Barty Crouch. Of course, Sirius muttered, pacing up and down. Of course, he'd want to pin it on anyone but his own elf. And then he sacked her. Yes, said Hermione in a heated voice. He sacked her just because she hadn't stayed in her tent and let herself get trampled. Hermione, would you give it a rest with the elf? Said Ron. Sirius shook his head and said, she's got the measure of Crouch better than you have, Ron. If you want to know what a man's like, take a good look at how he treats his inferiors, not his equals. He ran a hand over his unshaven face, evidently thinking hard. All these absences of Barty Crouch's, he goes to the trouble of making sure his house elf saves him a seat at the Quidditch World Cup, but doesn't bother to turn up and watch. He works very hard to reinstate the Triwizard Tournament, and then stops coming to that too. It's not like Crouch. If he's ever taken a day off work because of illness before this, I'll eat Buckbeak. Do you know Crouch, then? Said Harry. Sirius's face darkened. He suddenly looked as menacing as he had the night when Harry first met him, the night when Harry still believed Sirius to be a murderer. Oh, I know Crouch all right, he said quietly. He was the one who gave the order for me to be sent to Azkaban without a trial. What? Said Ron and Hermione together. You're kidding, said Harry. No, I'm not, said Sirius, taking another great bite of chicken. Crouch used to be head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, didn't you know? Harry, Ron, and Hermione shook their heads. He was tipped for the next Minister of Magic, said Sirius. He's a great wizard, Barty Crouch, powerfully magical and power-hungry. Oh, never a Voldemort supporter, he said, reading the look on Harry's face. No, Barty Crouch was always very outspoken against the dark side. But then a lot of people who were against the dark side, well, you wouldn't understand. You're too young. So Barty Crouch is a powerful wizard. Barty Crouch is power-hungry. Barty Crouch has found himself the focal point of some very odd details that have unfolded over the course of the last year or so. And Sirius is putting the pieces together. He has also been responsible for Sirius Black's incarceration in Azkaban without, we must note, a trial. This is more than the abstract. This is personal. But even now, Sirius, well, he harbors concerns, but I'm not sure that it's fair to say that he harbors an outright grudge against Barty Crouch. Look at how he talks about him. He's a great wizard, Barty Crouch, powerfully magical and power-hungry, never a Voldemort supporter. Barty Crouch was always very outspoken against the dark side, but then a lot of people who were against the dark side, ominous ellipsis. That takes us into our next slide. We're going to talk about the next slide, then we'll circle back around to discuss Barty Crouch in general. Ron protests that his dad basically said the same thing. Arthur Weasley demurred from talking more fully to Ron at that point, but Sirius decides that he's going to give it a go. All right, I'll try you. He walked once up the cave, back again, and then said, imagine that Voldemort's powerful now. You don't know who his supporters are. You don't know who's working for him and who isn't. You know he can control people so they can do terrible things without being able to stop themselves. You're scared for yourself, for your family, and your friends. Every week, news comes of more deaths, more disappearances, more torturing. The Ministry of Magic's in disarray. They don't know what to do. They're trying to keep everything hidden from the Muggles, but meanwhile, Muggles are dying too. Terror everywhere. Panic. Confusion. That's how it used to be. Well, times like that bring out the best in some people, and the worst in others. Crouch's principles might have been good in the beginning, I wouldn't know. He rose quickly through the ministry and he started ordering very harsh measures against Voldemort's supporters. The Aurors were given new powers to kill rather than capture, for instance. And I wasn't the only one who was handed straight to the Dementors without trial. Crouch fought violence with violence and authorized the use of the unforgivable curses against suspects. I would say he became as ruthless and cruel as many on the dark side. He had his supporters, mind you. Plenty of people thought he was going about things the right way, and there were a lot of witches and wizards clamoring for him to take over as Minister of Magic. When Voldemort disappeared, it looked like only a matter of time until Crouch got the top job. But then something rather unfortunate happened. Sirius smiled grimly. Crouch's own son was caught with a group of Death Eaters who'd managed to talk their way out of Azkaban. Apparently, they were trying to find Voldemort and return him to power. This is one of the most rich and evocative and challenging and adult perspectives on good and evil that we've had in the Harry Potter series to date. Prior to this, we've actually spent a lot of time here in Dear Mr. Potter talking about dark wizardry, talking about the opposite of dark wizardry, talking about dark arts and the defense against the dark arts, talking about what it is that distinguishes Albus Dumbledore from Voldemort. You'll remember, of course, that is introduced right back at the beginning of Philosopher's Stone, right? Minerva McGonagall says to Dumbledore that the two are very alike, but there are some things that Dumbledore won't do. There is a line that Dumbledore will not cross, and right from the jump, we are instructed, we are guided to see that as the defining difference between good and evil in the world of Harry Potter. It's not about power per se. It's not even about allegiance per se. It's not certainly about virtue, right? Because we have the Hogwarts houses looking at virtue in very complex and sometimes sophisticated and somewhat rather trivial ways, right? It's about what you are willing to do. It's about the lines that you are willing to cross. And here, Sirius gives us exposition that indicates that actually the rules bounding, defining wizarding society have never been as strong as we would like to believe that they are. That this transition into the Prisoner of Azkaban Goblet of Fire phase of the Harry Potter series has precedent. That back in the days of the Wizarding World, back during the tyranny of Lord Voldemort, well, some people crossed the line without actually becoming dark wizards at all. Crouch's principles might have been good in the beginning, I wouldn't know. The implication there, of course, being that his principles were definitely not good by the end. He rose quickly through the ministry and he started ordering very harsh measures against Voldemort's supporters. The Aurors were given new powers to kill rather than capture, for instance. Powers here, legalistic powers, I take, rather than magical powers, right? The Aurors were not given new spells and new enchantments which allowed them to kill rather than capture. They were instead empowered by the law of the wizarding world to kill rather than to capture. And I wasn't the only one who was handed straight to the Dementors without trial, right? The presumed right to fair trial, which is never stated outright in the Harry Potter series before this point, but which we, as residents of the Western world, I suppose, residents of that British legalistic tradition, we assume that the right to a fair trial is pretty universal and pretty fundamental and pretty indivisible, but not so in the last days of Voldemort's tyranny. Crouch fought violence with violence and authorized the use of the unforgivable curses against suspects. I would say he became as ruthless and cruel as many on the dark side. That's pretty definitive. Crouch crossed lines. He crossed the line of using violence against violence. That's not a Dumbledorian line at all, right? That's not what good people do traditionally in the frame of Harry Potter. Good people can be driven to violence, but only as a last recourse, and only then in the protection of others, not even usually in the protection of themselves, but in the protection of innocence. Good people can be driven to the use of violence. But worse still, he authorized the use of the unforgivable curses. And as is implied, as we have explored in the pages of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire already, using the unforgivable curses, pretty much the worst thing that a wizard can do, right? Like quantifiably, objectively, the worst thing that a wizard can do. That is why these three curses are held apart. A lifetime in Azkaban for using one. That's what you get in this new and better wizarding world. The kind of post-rise of Barty Crouch world, I suppose. I have no idea at what point Aurors were... Well, actually, you know what? I'm reading into that. That may not be the case at all. I am suspecting that the powers of the Aurors were retracted, were diminished after the fact, but that may in fact not be the case at all. We don't know anything about Aurors who are currently active in the wizarding world. So it's possible that they are still legally empowered to use the unforgivable curses. You would have assumed that Mad-Eye Moody would have mentioned that back in the Defense Against the Dark Arts class in which the unforgivable curses were introduced, but hey, he's Mad-Eye Moody, isn't he? That's who he is, and in either sense, there may be reasons why Mad-Eye Moody would not want, in fact, to communicate the fact that Aurors are still empowered to use the unforgivable curses to the school children at Hogwarts. The crossing of this line isn't just powerful within the frame of the wizarding world, though. It isn't just powerful because we have been clued to see this as what separates good wizards from bad wizards, what separates Dumbledore and Voldemort, what separates Harry and Draco Malfoy, right? That ruthlessness, specific ruthlessness, that willingness to do whatever is necessary in the pursuit of your goals, to violate trust and authority, to violate your own fundamental principles in the pursuit of your goal. That, of course, isn't just powerfully emotive and powerfully significant and philosophically potent within the pages of Harry Potter. It's super philosophically... I mean, I'm hesitating even to use that rather wry phrase that I just used because it is just so much more important. Hey, you guys, this is the world that we live in. This is the post-9/11 world, right? The world has changed since J.K. Rowling wrote this book, but she has anticipated it perfectly because fascism and tyranny always rise in exactly the same way. When we begin denying freedom, when we begin denying identity, when we begin denying our own better instincts, when we stop listening to the better angels of our nature and we start turning to a ruthless kind of pragmatism, then society falls apart. Society exists, I believe, because of this consensual and voluntary arrangement at which we have all arrived to actually do more than the bare minimum, to actually allow for the possibility that individuals are going to stand in opposition to society and not care, not violate who and what we are in order to eliminate that opposition, in order to eliminate that danger, right? Security and freedom are always in uncomfortable alliance. And when we swing too far one way, or when we swing too far either way, then we are rejecting the obligation that is laid upon us by our best instincts and greatest virtues, but also by the consensual arrangements of societies in the first place. That has happened in the Wizarding War. That happened during the tyranny of Voldemort, and Barty Crouch was right there. Let's wrap up this chapter then. I think this is going to be our last... Yes, Wilhelm Scream saying here, first they came for the Mudbloods, and I said nothing. That is a shade too dark even for me on this. But yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Yeah, no. And Melissa pointing out here, this is getting deep, y'all. Yeah, no, it super is, right? This is... Hey, you guys remember the first book? Remember, hey, let's go to Hogwarts and every flavor beans and chocolate frogs, and isn't it fun and isn't it great? And Quidditch is awesome, and robes and the Great Hall. And yeah, no, Harry Potter as a series is no longer that. It hasn't been that for some time, in fact, both within the text and now apparently within the fictional frame too, right? This is resetting our understanding of what the wizarding world is, and we are already inspired to see the cracks and the flaws and the outright rank hypocrisy in the ministry and in all of the institutional structures that we encounter in the wizarding world. Even, I dare say, Hogwarts. Snape stands as an example of that rank hypocrisy and abuse of authority. He absolutely does. But he's not the only one. This is an ongoing problem in the wizarding world because of power, because of personal power. Let's finish up this week's reading. I'm not even going to try and get into chapter 28 this week. Instead, let's look at the mystery of Severus Snape. This is our last slide from this chapter. What do you think, Sirius? Harry said loudly, and Ron and Hermione stopped bickering to listen. I think they both got a point, said Sirius, looking thoughtfully at Ron and Hermione. Ever since I found out Snape was teaching here, I've wondered why Dumbledore hired him. Snape's always been fascinated by the dark arts. He was famous for it at school. Slimy, oily, greasy-haired kid he was, Sirius added, and Harry and Ron grinned at each other. Snape knew more curses when he arrived at school than half the kids in 7th year, and he was a part of a gang of Slytherins who nearly all turned out to be Death Eaters. Sirius held up his fingers and began ticking off names. Rosier and Wilkes, they were both killed by Aurors the year before Voldemort fell. The Lestranges, they're a married couple, they're in Azkaban. Avery, from what I've heard, he wormed his way out of trouble by saying he'd been acting under the Imperious curse. He's still at large. But as far as I know, Snape was never even accused of being a Death Eater. Not that that means much. Plenty of them were never caught, and Snape's certainly clever and cunning enough to keep himself out of trouble. Ever since I found out Snape was teaching here, I've wondered why Dumbledore hired him. We've hit this drum twice now in quick succession, right? We've had Hagrid talking about why Dumbledore, why Dumbledore is great, and then we had Mad-Eye Moody talking about why Dumbledore and why Dumbledore is great. In fact, we had Mad-Eye Moody specifically talking about why Dumbledore hired Snape, because Dumbledore believes in second chances. Sirius Black doesn't understand that. And that may be because he doesn't know Dumbledore as well as Hagrid or as well as Mad-Eye Moody. Of course he doesn't, right? He's been in Azkaban for a while, and then he was in exile, so his relationship with Dumbledore is necessarily different, but he also obviously respects Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore holds a position of authority in Sirius Black's worldview, right? Right back at the beginning of this book, in one of his first interactions with Harry, he acknowledges that Dumbledore is wise enough to see what is going on, right? Dumbledore is not an obstacle for Sirius Black, and certainly not an object of any suspicion or derision. But nonetheless, he doesn't understand. Dumbledore hiring Snape because he believes in second chances does seem to be completely consistent with what we've been given. And I do see this as being part of a 3-beat, right? We get a really nicely constructed 3-beat about the goodness of Albus Dumbledore. Hagrid asserts, Dumbledore, great man, that Dumbledore, great man, right? Because he sees the possibility of redemption and because he offers second chances, even when there is no guarantee that it's going to work out, even when, wiser men might back away from the hiring of one Severus Snape as a potions master at Hogwarts, for example, the outright and publicly ruthless and Machiavellian and horribly ambitious Severus Snape. No, Dumbledore sees the potential for good and is willing to take the risk himself, right? If Snape turns out to be a Death Eater, there's no question that Dumbledore is going to continue on as headmaster of Hogwarts, right? Rita Skeeter herself would come and drag him out of the building along with a mob armed with torches and pitchforks. There's no way. Albus Dumbledore's professional reputation and his potential for doing good in the context of Hogwarts is absolutely on the line with regard to Snape. Hagrid asserts Dumbledore gives second chances. That's what makes him a great man. Moody comes in and says Dumbledore gives second chances. Definitely a thing that Dumbledore can do, but I don't believe in second chances. I don't believe that people can be redeemed always. I believe that some spots are never washed clean. And now Sirius is failing to get the point entirely, or alternatively is getting the point but can't believe it, can't reconcile it with what he knows of Severus Snape. Ever since I found out Snape was teaching here, I've wondered why Dumbledore hired him. I take that to mean that he doesn't understand Albus Dumbledore. He doesn't understand the possibility of second chances and the light, the goodness, the hope, the grace of possible redemption, right? But it is also possible that Sirius Black completely understands that part of Dumbledore's character and doesn't understand with specific regard to Snape. It may just be that the possibility of redemption is not for Snape, right? It is the impossibility of redemption in the case of one Severus Snape. Snape's always been fascinated by the dark arts. He was famous for it at school. Slimy, oily, greasy-haired kid he was. Snape knew more curses when he arrived at school than half the kids in 7th year, and he was part of a gang of Slytherins who nearly all turned out to be Death Eaters. And hey, let's expand our worldview here, right? Let's get some proper nouns, some of which are going to be significant later. Rosier and Wilkes, they were both killed by Aurors the year before Voldemort fell. The Lestranges, they're a married couple. They're in Azkaban. Avery, from what I've heard, he wormed his way out of trouble by saying he'd been acting under the Imperious curse. He's still at large, but as far as I know, Snape was never even accused of being a Death Eater. Not that that means much. And I meant to talk about this on the last slide, actually. The tragedy of Barty Crouch's as yet unnamed son, right? Who finds himself caught up with Death Eaters who have, according to Sirius Black, talked their way out of Azkaban. I want to know more about that. I want to know exactly how that went down. I want to know exactly what went on at Azkaban, where these incredibly skilled and eloquent, presumably Slytherin kids, former Slytherin kids, new Death Eaters in the service of Lord Voldemort, managed to talk their way past Dementors. Yeah, I'm not at all sure how that works. Maybe they gave up other names, right? Maybe they offered up others to the rapacious hunger for justice and the perception of justice that has swept the wizarding world at that point. Maybe. I just don't know. We can't speculate just yet. So this is the position in which we find ourselves. There is a looming threat. We've seen that all over, right? We get Sirius carrying the daily prophets. He's been gathering information. He's seen the shadow coming. Something is happening. Something is going on here, and it is definitely not good. And it clearly ties back into the person of Barty Crouch, but also the symbol of Barty Crouch. This good wizard, capital G, capital W, who fought the dark wizards during the tyranny of Voldemort, but in so doing crossed the line and fell from righteousness, fell from real justice, and ultimately, of course, sacrificed his son, lost his wife because of the decisions that he made, because of his desire for power. This is all very bleak. This is all very depressing. This is all very true to the real adult world in which we find ourselves. Not incompatible with our perspective on the wizarding world up to this point, but certainly an evolution, a development of that wizarding world. This is... Gosh, you guys, this is pretty tough. Yeah. It is also 10:30 here in Oklahoma City, and that means that I'm out of time. So we made it through chapter 27, which I don't feel bad about at all. Theoretically, we are supposed to look at chapters 29 and 30 next week. Let's call it chapters 28 and 29. So we are going to look at the madness of Mr. Crouch and the dream in next week's session. Next week's session, as I said right at the beginning of tonight's discussion, it's not going to take place next Tuesday. I'm going to bump it by, I'm going to pull it up, in fact, by a couple of days. So next week's session will be at 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central on Sunday, April the 22nd, 2018. That will be the 51st session here in Harry Potter, here in Dear Mr. Potter, the 14th session in our discussion of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, I guess. Let me cancel this slide and maybe see if we can take a quick question here. This question from Sarah is about chapter 28. We'll come back to this. Yes, there's too much magic in the air. I know. I love this too, right? This is why... okay, we can't talk about it. This is why bugs and electronic devices won't work at Hogwarts, according to Hermione. Yeah, we will definitely, I promise you, Sarah, talk about that next week. Wilhelm Scream says here in the questions box, Rowling often receives and sometimes deserves criticisms for forced plot connections and developments, and of course, revisionist history. But I think it's a particularly deft bit of connective tissue to make Gillyweed both Harry's salvation in the second task and lead to an important but understated reveal about someone else brewing up polyjuice potion. Thoughts? Completely agree. In fact, completely agree. I did, I lighted on this a little last week without really delving into the conclusion of the mystery because of some spoilery details that are connected to the reveal when we finally get to it. The way that this is orchestrated, though, I would encourage you to look at this point at the book that Moody gave to Neville after potentially at least deliberately terrifying Neville Longbottom. Mad-Eye Moody soothes him by giving him a book, Care of Magical Plants, and this is relevant, right? This is an important plot beat here, and this is why it is such a nice adaptive choice in the movie for Goblet of Fire to have Neville give Harry the information about the Gillyweed rather than Dobby. That's a strong adaptive choice that I support completely. There is no space in that movie adaptation for the SPEW storyline. I'm glad that we don't even touch it. I'm glad that we don't go anywhere near it. It makes for a tighter story, honestly, in the 2-hour running time of Goblet of Fire. So that's the first incident. Then we get, of course, Dobby overhearing Mad-Eye Moody and Minerva McGonagall talking about the second task, just kind of casually talking with someone who is possessed of a natural sight, of magically augmented sight here. It is pretty clear, I think, that Dobby is supposed to overhear that conversation. It is pretty clear that Mad-Eye Moody is orchestrating things behind the scenes, at least supplying Harry with support. Explicit and implicit, I suppose, is the best way of putting it, right? I love the way that this is constructed. And of course, as you point out, Wilhelm, right? We're also getting the boomslang skin and the acknowledgement that Hermione stole that for the polyjuice potion and the missing Gillyweed too. It's a really deft piece of construction. It's a really smart piece of construction. There are points in this book in particular, and I say this book in particular in the context of the first 4 books. This is by no means the most egregious in this regard, right? We're going to talk about Half-Blood Prince some fine day at the end of next year, in fact, as I mentioned earlier, right at the beginning of tonight's session. There are some points in J.K. Rowling's storytelling where she just forces a plot point through, where it's an unsustainable and poorly scaffolded, poorly structured, poorly sometimes conceived bit of plot work, and there are elements of the story that don't quite align as nicely as this, but this is really tight storytelling. This is very, very strong. I am inclined to completely agree with you there. Rayla Lynn saying, Hermione being Crumb's important person seems strange to me. He's clearly more into her than vice versa, but is that important? Maybe it's most important person nearby. Fleur's sister, Ron, Hermione, and Cho are already at Hogwarts. Crumb's family isn't mentioned, so they likely aren't at the tournament. He doesn't seem particularly close to any of his classmates. What do you guys think? Also, when do you think Rita crosses the line? Yeah, well, we had a little discussion about Rita earlier tonight. It's either Hagrid or Hermione. It's one of these two articles, I think, is the point at which, yes, she passes that moral event horizon. We did talk about this a little bit last week because it is a little odd that Crumb's hostage in the second task is his date to the Yule Ball, and Cedric's hostage in the second task is his date to the Yule Ball. I did kind of deconstruct that a little bit last week. And also, of course, we should note, Gabrielle, as I said, because of some backfill exposition that we get in Deathly Hallows, is 8 years old during the events of Goblet of Fire. She doesn't seem to be a part of the Beauxbaton delegation. She doesn't seem to be of an age with the rest of the kids. At least no other young children are mentioned as a part of the Beauxbaton delegation. I think that she was brought along expressly to be this driving force for Fleur. And I was thinking about this after last week's session, right? I was talking about the familial connection between Fleur and Gabrielle. I was talking about the pseudo-familial, but really just familial connection between Harry and Ron, too. Ron is to Harry as a brother is to Harry at this point in the story, as he should be, right? That works beautifully for me. But there is also this weird inversion where Cedric and Victor are supposed to save their dates. They are supposed to save girls that they met a handful of months ago and only asked out, 6 weeks before the second task, right? They've had this very short romantic relationship, which does seem to be utterly sincere from Victor, right? He has never felt this way about a girl before. He has already asked Hermione to go with him to his home over the summer holidays. That's perfectly fine. Victor is crazy about Hermione, and that's just fine. But Cedric, I don't know that Cedric feels the same way about Cho. And even if they do, the fact that they are romantic relationships is a little more complicated. And it's complicated still further by virtue of the fact that Fleur is not motivated by a romantic relationship, right? It would be one thing if all of the hostages, right? I would be completely fine if all 4 hostages were the dates that the champions had taken to the Yule Ball, right? There's a certain efficiency there. It's a nice bit of mechanistic construction there. And it would also, because Fleur would also be rescuing her damseled date, it would be a little less problematic in terms of its gendering, I think. As it stands, though, I just can't distill out a single unified truth. I do find it problematic. I do find it a little bit difficult that Harry has been friends with Ron now for 3.5 years. They are closer than any other 2 people at Hogwarts, for all that we know. You know, they are fast friends. They are basically brothers at this point. Of course, this is going to motivate Harry. Is Cedric's relationship with Cho the same kind of relationship? I mean, it's not, right? Like, it can't be. I mean, we have no reason to believe that Cedric had ever spoken to Cho before asking her to go to the Yule Ball, right? We have no reason to believe that is the case. And yet, here we are. This isn't a long-term friendship. This is a short-term romance. And for all that Victor is clearly crazy about Hermione, and I actually buy that Victor is motivated by Hermione's damseling during the second task there, I don't know that says very good things about our relationship dynamics, about our gender dynamics, about the underlying concept for the second task at all, right? Was the second task always going to be this? If it was always going to be this, were the judges just scrutinizing everything that Victor and Cedric, and to a lesser extent Harry, I suppose, did over the course of the last 6 months so that they can determine, him, actually. Yeah, we'll take Ron. Ron's clearly the person that means the most to Harry in the world. If Ron and Harry's fight had continued, who's next? If Ron and Harry had still been on the outs by the time that we get to the second task because of Ron's jealousy over Harry's celebrity with regard to the Triwizard Tournament, who would have been picked? Would it have been Ginny? Maybe? Neville? Maybe? Hagrid? I don't know. I have no idea, what we're to make of that. But God, Harry trying to swim back to the surface of the lake carrying Hagrid would have been a much more difficult task, right? That would have been absolutely, tipping the scales there a little bit against Harry in the frame of the Triwizard Tournament. But yeah, there are some complicated things that we must seek to unpick with regard to the hostages there in the second task. Yeah. All right, you guys, let's wrap it up there. This has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me for the 50th session here of Dear Mr. Potter. I hope that you will all be able to join me on Sunday. Monday for the 51st session, in which, as I say, we'll catch up with chapter 28 and 29. I'm still adding extra sessions to the series as we go forward. The pace is still never quite where we want it to be, but I'm sure that none of you mind spending just a couple of extra weeks in the company of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. This has been an absolute pleasure. I will talk to you all again very soon. Until then, good night and mischief managed.